Texas Secretary of State John Scott, thank you so much for joining us. We do appreciate it. So the final numbers are out now, and we now know how many mail ballots were rejected. More than 24,000 statewide, 254 counties, a little more than 12%. Why did this happen?
So we had 3,029,000 votes cast in the primary, and there were, like you said, a little over 24,000 ballots that were rejected, and so that's about 0.8% in the overall election. On the mail-in ballot specifically, the ones that were submitted, that number reduced down to about, or increased to about 12% if we just consider that small group. The vast majority of what we're getting, and again, this is secondhand information, it's developed by the counties, reported from the counties up to the state. It seems to be that folks left off overwhelmingly the required identification number, either their DPS issued information or the last four of their Social Security.
That was primarily the reason, right?
That's what is being reported to us.
And normally it's far lower, right? The rejection rate on mail ballots.
Well, we've really never captured that as a state. I mean, it's in the system probably, and someone can go back and rework those numbers, but something that we have historically captured, it's not there. A lot of times some of the offline counties have not necessarily reported all that information into our system. We feel positive that information lies at each of the counties for past elections.
And among Republicans, there were 10,355 of the mail-in ballots that were rejected, or about 11.8%. Among Democrats, more than 14,000, or about 12.9%. Was there any particular reason that you found that there were more Democrats than Republicans? Any trends that you noticed?
Well, we didn't look into any of the actual granularity, and out of those rejected ballots, we really don't know how many as a state, how many of those folks actually ended up voting, because their ballot was rejected does not mean they didn't vote in the election. And the reason that's true is those folks, once they're notified that their ballot was rejected, can still go vote provisionally in person. And there's some inferential kind of evidence that leads me to believe, at least from what others have reported, that there may have been a high number of provisional ballots, and a high number of those provisional ballots were counted. Again, we could get back to the counties and derive what that actual number is, so that's going to be important to understand what the overall rejection rate was.
So I know that voters had the opportunity to go, once they were notified, if they were notified, which they should have been, by the counties, to go back and correct any mistakes.
That's correct.
And so I'm wondering, is there a number out there of how many people were able to correct their mistakes? Or is that something that your office is going to do?
Well, that's something we can get, all of us can get from the counties, but ultimately it would be cross-reference. I mean, the easiest way to get that number would be to do an evaluation of those persons whose ballots, mail-in ballots, were rejected, and to find out if those folks cast a provisional ballot, and then to find out if that provisional ballot was accepted. And we would get that from the counties.
And that's required that they do that, right?
The counties have to capture those information fields, yes. And they're supposed to.
And at some point, is your office going to want to take that look, and, will you tell your guys, hey, let's figure this out on a statewide basis?
Oh, I think that's absolutely part of the process that's going on right now, is to try and look at what is being provided to us. And at least the first layer has been where it looked like some of the counties may have reported information that doesn't make sense. And an example is, because the primaries are run by the parties, some of the party chairs from some of the counties had actually included both their party total number of votes with the other party's total number of votes. And so it looked like more people had voted than should have in that primary. And so when we reached back as an office to the counties to clarify that, in fact, the information was it was reported incorrectly, so they needed to fix that. And that was one of the things that our office has spent a great deal of time working with the counties to make sure that ultimately we get accurate information in there, so we can find out how the numbers line up. Our biggest concern is to make sure that the voting rosters, those persons who signed in to vote, adds up at the end with the number of votes cast, or the number of votes that were rejected for some reason or fleeing voters. I mean, there can be all kinds of reasons, but at the end, you want all those numbers to add up to the same thing, or as close to zero as possible for differences.
Now, this was the first election held since the new law went into effect, SB 1. And so I'm wondering, how did the counties do in as far as their requirements measuring up to the new law?
Well, so far it looks like they did a phenomenal job. It's been a learning curve for them, I think, as well. We've understood that some of the counties, again, these are all secondhand stories, but some of the counties went so far as to highlight the boxes of required information on the mail-in ballots. We think that it's a great idea. So the counties have a lot of discretion, as long as they get the required language on, for instance, a mail-in ballot cover, the envelope. So one of the ideas that we're going to roll out to the counties, and we're going to do the form for them, is to add a red box around the other two required fields. It's currently around, it encapsulates where the signature is required, so we're going to put it up on those other forms of identification. I think it's a great idea that some of the counties came up, or at least one I know of that came up with the idea of just highlighting for its folks. Put this information in so that they knew to do it. You know, for instance, I can give you some of the Dallas County and Tarrant and their rejection rate, as well as Collin County, at least on the reported information. Dallas County's rejection rate was 9.5%. Tarrant County's rejection rate was 8.1%. And Collin County's rejection rate was 13%. They ran joint primaries, and so those numbers are reported in a joint way. They're not broken down by Republican or Democrat, but overall that's what their rejection rates were. So at least in two of those counties, Dallas and Tarrant, it was significantly below what the statewide average was, and Collin County was about what the statewide average was. We have not gotten in to find out why those numbers are where they are.
Is that something your office is going to investigate?
Yes, and part of that is to try and figure out, is there a better practice? Is there a better way to inform the voters? And that's part of the process that we'll go nonstop through November, which is educating voters on what is the best path forward. What are best ways to do things? We have put out there, it's not required, but we think it's the best practice to put both numbers on from the voter's standpoint, because only one of those numbers has to match what's in your record.
We spoke with a couple of voters last week who told us that they are lifelong voters. They take their responsibility very seriously. They have voted by mail for the past 15 years, and this time around they couldn't vote in the primary because of mistakes on their mail ballot. They happen to be older, and getting to the polling location is difficult for them, and so they rely on mail-in ballots. And they were very upset by this, and one of them said that it felt like this bordered on harassment. So what do you say to voters who feel that way?
Well, no one wants anyone to feel like they're harassed. But I think one of the things to always remember about a mail-in ballot is the process. 100% of the folks that received a mail-in ballot got through the process of providing the required information that the new statute required, because they had to do an application for ballot by mail. It requires that same information, that same identification. So we know that 100% of those voters were able to get a ballot, that received a ballot, knew how to do the process and did it correctly, or they wouldn't have gotten a ballot. And so the disconnect is why there was then this subgroup of people that were able to get through that process but then couldn't follow that same direction. Again, as a state, 99.2% of the state was able to provide the accurate representations that they needed, the identification, in order to have their ballot counted.
And what is your message to voters going forward? Because we still have the runoff election on May 24th. You've got the municipal elections actually before that, May 7th, and then the general election, November 8th.
So we've got the constitutional election, which is joined with those city elections, that takes place on May 7th. And voters, the first thing we would tell voters that haven't registered to vote, go out and register to vote. You've got today and tomorrow to get that thing registered, to postmark it so that it's postmarked by tomorrow so that you can participate in that election. That's message number one. Message number two is take the time to become informed. Go out there and vote as an informed, eligible voter and get your vote in, whether you do it in early voting or if you show up in person on the day of the election. The other thing to remember is on those elections that are coming up, to the extent they have questions, ask the elections administrator. Call our office. There's a number of very helpful groups that are out there, and their single sole goal is to help voters get across the finish line and cast that ballot.
One of the things that the ladies we spoke with said is they said, make the print bigger, because if the seniors are predominantly the ones who vote by mail, and they said it's so tiny that it would be helpful if they made it larger. They also suggested what you said some counties did, which was highlight the areas that are required so that there are fewer mistakes and people know exactly what to do.
Well, I think the print size is one of those issues that is required by statute in a fairly finite amount of space. And one of the issues becomes running the materials through the post office and being able to handle those envelopes at a rate that doesn't break the counties. And so there's a little bit of stuff, theoretically it could be on any size envelope that would capture that and make it easier to read. I think what people have tried to shoot for is something that's the most reasonable, cost-effective way to get it done so that it's still affordable to run these elections that way at the county level, because they're the ones that bear the cost on that. But is it small? Absolutely. I need glasses to read it, and it's helpful to have a magnifying glass sometimes.
Let me ask you about voter education. How much does your office have to do, going forward? Because we have more elections that are going to be taking place. And how important a responsibility is that?
I think it's I think it's a critical message, not just for our office, but everybody connected to the voting system. And it's to not just to help inform voters, but it's to make sure we have sufficient, to preach a message out there that participating in our elections, perhaps as a election poll worker, our counties need those folks. They need people to step up and volunteer. And so to the extent people are worried about voter integrity or access to the voting polls, become a participant. Volunteer to go out there and work those elections. Satisfy yourself that there are no issues actually with either of those ways, or to the extent you see something and you see a better way that can be done, say something. Say this is a problem. Help the system. Become a volunteer. Become part of the election process. So I think that's part of the message. We're going to still spend about $2.5 million as a state on outreach programs. We're going to go to community centers where seniors are there as part of the whole voter identification. The federal government gives us some funds in order to address the voter ID issues. And that's especially voter ID issues are at the heart of the mail-in ballot and the new requirements. So we're going to focus very aggressively on those issues and try and go to places where the seniors are. We're going to try and identify if there's been bigger issues in certain parts of the state, and if there are, to the extent there are, we want to focus our efforts maybe disproportionately in those locations.
I know we have the state fair, the Texas State Fair is in Dallas every year. Is that something that you would consider having a public education, campaign?
I think any place where we see a lot of people where there's an opportunity to address the masses, yes, absolutely. I think that's a great idea.
And let me ask you, as far as the amount of money, you mentioned, I think it was another $2.5 million. Is that enough? Did the legislature give your office and the counties enough money to educate the public? Because these are changes, and it did trip up more people than expected, or more people than in past years, obviously.
It's interesting because we know again that 100% of the people that got a ballot to go submit it include 100% of the people that had their ballot rejected for failure to provide that information of some kind. We know that they did it right the first time to get through the application for ballot by mail. So it's hard to understand, at least from my standpoint, what is the message you tell somebody that did it correctly the first time but couldn't get across the finish line the second time. There were a lot of those applications that were rejected for the ballots that were rejected for the same reasons that were rejected in the past, which was a signature, which has always been required. People just forgot to sign. I don't know that there's what we can do with advertising to get it to 100% participation where there's no errors. Obviously, we want to spend every dime of that money to make sure that what we are allotted is spent and spent effectively, and that's really our goal.
A couple other questions real quick, and that is, you talked about some of the counties with some of their ideas. Are there any specific counties that really had the best practices that you've seen so far that you're willing to name and give them a shout out?
We really want to dig in a little deeper because we want to find out. One of the things I'm interested in is which of the counties work to try and identify issues with a mail-in ballot, and then to use those 6 days following the day of the election to help that voter cure those deficiencies. And I'd love to know what that rate is. But again, that's something we're going to have to visit with the different counties and find out, because we don't capture that information. In the future, that may be one of the things we ask the legislature to give us some recording requirements at the county level, so we can make sure that people are following back up with these voters to try and fix the deficiencies that are fixable.
I was just going to ask you, is there anything that you believe the state legislature needs to follow up on in the new session, or perhaps more urgently in a special session before November?
Well, I can't imagine there's anything that we'd want to do before the election process. I mean, I think there's been enough changes that the counties have gone through, and we're trying. We especially tried from the time for the 2 months before the March 1st primaries to let the counties focus on that issue alone. So to go out there and try and change it anymore before the next 3 elections, the constitutional elections on May 7th, the runoffs on May 24th, or the November general elections, I think that's asking to put too much in, and I think the counties are already stretched pretty thin on trying to get stuff done.
And that raises another question in my mind. Did the state legislature give the counties and your office enough time to, take that new law and enact it?
At the end of the day, we had 3.2 million, the most that had ever voted in a primary in the state. And so I think that's really an impressive thing. Whether more time would have made it run smoother or not, I don't know. But what we know is that it ran smooth enough for a record number of voters to participate.
All right. John Scott, Texas Secretary of State, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Jack, thank you for having me. Great to visit with you.